Okay, so welcome everybody to what's now our 12th Kurdish Tuesday. I'm Sarah Glynn from Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I want to just hand over to Ugo from the Kurdish community here in Edinburgh to tell us details of a protest here in Scotland that's in support of the arrested and imprisoned members of the People's Democratic Party, the HDP in Turkey. And it's also designed to draw attention to all the other actions that have attacked hopes for peace and democracy in Turkey, including the imprisonment and isolation of Abdullah Öcalan. So hand over to you, Ugo. Let's just unmute you. Yeah. Lost you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Right, okay, so I'm just going to start. So I want to first thank you to everybody who's watching us and then joining the Zoom meeting on today. And I would like to say, I want to start by saying that I wish we could have brought together tens and hundreds of friends and comrades for this march, but unfortunately, the current circumstances continue to have negative impact on our activities. The aim of our march starting tomorrow in Dundee and finishing in front of the Scottish Parliament on Friday is to raise awareness to the political genocide against the HDP and human rights issues relating to this. On 7th of September, over 100 HDP, People Democratic Party members, were once again arrested, including councillors and MPs. To date, over 12,000 HDP members have been arrested. These arrests are unlawful and wholly political in nature, alleging vague and unjustified links with the terrorism to deprive the Kurdish population of their chosen representatives, undergird everyone in Turkey who has committed to democracy and human rights. Yeah. Just 2 minutes. Just 1 second, please.
Oh, we've lost your sound.
Hi, sorry, just making sure the parking space, and I'll just be with you in 1 second. I've actually been working, so I just took a quick break to just do the work. Yeah, sorry about it. So just 1 minute. Right, okay, that's safe now. So we're basically saying that over 12,000 members of the HDP have been arrested, and these arrests are unlawful and wholly political in nature. Alleging vague and unjustified links to terrorism to deprive the Kurdish population of their chosen representative endangers everyone in Turkey who is committed to their chosen to democracy and human rights, and destroys any prospect of the peace. The continuing isolation of Abdullah Öcalan, Kurdish leader, growing oppressive measures by the Turkish government, and acts of their fascism by the AKP and MHP coalition, and evidence of the continuing psychological war on the Kurdish people. It is for the reason, even when faced a global pandemic, we have no choice but stand in solidarity with our friends and comrades who continue their struggle against fascism day in and out. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And just to say to anybody who's in Scotland, so the march will be leaving Dundee first thing tomorrow morning. If you are around and want to see them off and give them a bit of support, they'll be in the city centre opposite Primark from 9, aiming to leave by 9:30, so don't leave it too late. But even more importantly, if you in Edinburgh or can make it to Edinburgh on Friday, we'll be gathering outside Holyrood at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and for speeches and support. So please come and show your support and let other people know what's happening, because that's the whole point of the protest. So thanks very much. I forgot to say to people, if anybody's got their mic open, can you turn it off, just because it's helps stop any risk of interruption and disturbance. And so now I'd very much like to welcome Hanifi Baris from the University of Aberdeen. And anybody who's been to our earlier talks will already know him, I think, from his very many really interesting contributions to previous discussions. But this time we're going to have a chance to hear about his own research and the book he's got coming out at the end of October, which has the same title as this talk today, The Kurdish Model of Political Community. So long ago, in what one might call perhaps BC, before COVID, we were going to hold a day school, we as in Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan, and our planned speakers included Dilla Durek, who gave our first Kurdish Tuesday, and also Hanifi. So I think you could say we've actually waited quite a long time for this talk today. And I confess, when I first heard about Hanifi's research into examples of radical democracy, I was just a wee bit jealous, as this was a subject of one of my many failed research proposals. But Hanifi is enormously better equipped to look at this than I would have been. So I'm just going to enjoy learning what he has to say about a subject which has vital importance for all of us. And I think that now that COVID has actually helped more people to question the old normal, serious analysis of a different way of running society is more urgently needed than ever it was. So I'll hand over to Hanifi.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much to Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan. Thank you for your kind words. Nothing of the sort, of course. We are all trying to learn and share our thoughts. So, welcome. I would like to welcome everybody. I hope you are not going to fall asleep. I hope it will be a kind of engaging talk. So I might have some slides later on, but for the time being, I will try to follow from the papers that I have in front of me. As Sarah has mentioned, this is the Kurdish model of political community is the title of the book that is upcoming. So I tried to put together the most important arguments or thoughts from the book I'd like to share with you, and then in the discussion I would very much like to listen to your thoughts. So the book basically aims to capture a distinctive future of Kurdish politics in Turkey. So it's basically about the Kurdish politics and political movements in Turkey, but it also covers the Rojava administration as well with regard to the theoretical pillars of the Kurdish model of political community, because although the model originates from Turkey, it has a better chance to be implemented in Syrian Kurdistan. But my focus will be mainly in Turkey, and when I talk about Rojava, I will specifically mention it. So, as I said, the book aims to capture a distinctive future of Kurdish politics. So this distinctive future is its tendency to establish and maintain self-rule through non-state political communities. So the book is meant to contribute to debates on Kurdish political aspiration. Existing discussions on the dominant Kurdish political movement in Turkey, and it used to be mainly in Syria as well, it used to focus on its, this discussion used to place Kurdish movements within nationalism, within the framework of nationalism. However, although they are engaged in nation building to some degree, the dominant Kurdish movements do not pursue state building. In that sense, they differ from nationalist movements in their goals. So the main question I try to answer, so every academic study starts with a question, and my question is whether Kurdish politics in Turkey is confined within frameworks of multiculturalism and nationalism, or does it go beyond state-sanctioned group rights and state building? This main question also leads to two related ones. So first, what, if anything, separates the dominant Kurdish political movement in Turkey from typical nationalist movements? And second, what implications does the movement's politics have with regard to discussion on the accommodation of Kurdish political aspirations in particular, and on political community in general? So understanding what Kurdish politics has to offer, offers to contribute to discussions is as important as applying ready-made framework to political integration and accommodation of Kurdish politics. Hence, this book focuses on historical and contemporary expressions of Kurdish politics that can contribute to the discussion. So my central thesis in the book is that the politics, so I keep talking about dominant Kurdish political movements in Turkey and in Syria. Of course, there are other political movements in these countries, in these parts of Kurdistan, let's say, but the movements I focus on are dominant movements there. So the central thesis of the book is that the dominant Kurdish political movement in Turkey and Syria, they go beyond integration, multicultural accommodation, and state building. They aspire to found coexisting transnational political communities on the basis of residence, not of cultural or national identity. And this is an alternative political community, if not a new one altogether. So I think this endeavor is long due a task because although there is a fairly rich literature on Kurds in Turkey and in Syria and elsewhere, the focus has mainly been on Kurdology. That means the historiography, sociology, and anthropology of the Kurds, but with a flavor of Orientalism and Eurocentrism, of course. So literature on Kurdish politics has mainly been concerned with Kurdish rebellions, Kurdish ethno-nationalism, Kurdish armed struggles, political parties, their interactions with and the reactions they get from nation states, and the development of Kurdish identity politics. Nevertheless, the goals of Kurdish political movements have mainly been taken for granted as reactionary responses to state politics, to nationalism and nation building. So thus, analytically, Kurdish politics is mainly condemned to a politics of belated and reactionary nationalism. I wanted to get away from that. Also, this book is an attempt to demonstrate that there is much more to Kurdish politics than what meets the eye at first glance. So put simply, I try to articulate the theoretical pillars of what I call the homegrown model of political community, promoted by the dominant Kurdish political movements in Turkey and Syria. So by so doing, I intend to highlight, on the one hand, a neglected characteristic of Kurdish politics: its apathy to state building that has deep historical roots, and on the other hand, I try to articulate theoretical implications of Kurdish politics with regard to four essential elements of political community: the act of foundation, autonomy or sovereignty or self-rule, citizenship, and political participation. So basically, political communities have these four elements. There is an act of foundation. Some political authority founds a political community. There is the element of sovereignty or autonomy. There is citizenship and political participation. But I have to start with, of course, certain clarifications and forewarnings. I should make clear that when I speak of the Kurdish model of political community, I basically refer to the model on the paper. I didn't have the opportunity to do the fieldwork in Rojava, where the model is in practice being implemented. So, and in Turkey, it was, when it was started to be implemented by councils or the Kurdish political movements of its branches, it met with harsh reaction from the Turkish state. So my work mostly relies on primary and secondary sources, as well as generic materials such as laws and constitutional drafts of the Kurdish administration in Syria. So although I followed very closely day by day the developments, the ground developments, mostly my analysis relate to written sources, because I couldn't do the field work. So to be sure, of course, all major Kurdish political movements, especially those in Iraq, have entertained the idea of establishing a Kurdish nation state throughout the 20th century. So while the major movements in Turkey and Syria have changed their course and transformed their politics from a left-leaning nationalism to a form of confederalism, those in Iraq and Iran have not undergone such a substantial change as far as I'm concerned. So when I speak of the Kurdish model of political community, it's mostly within the context of North and West Kurdistan, that is Kurdistan in Turkey and Kurdistan in Syria. So I also have to say a few words about my choice of words. Scholarship on Kurdish politics in history has mainly focused on the origins of the so-called Kurdish question or Kurdish ethno-nationalism. So I will refrain from using both terms because they are negatively charged rather than being neutral. So these terms reflect two main approaches to Kurdish politics, especially in Turkey and in Syria. The former, the Kurdish question, represents the approach that tends to focus on external factors. It implies that Kurdish politics is dominated by geographical, social, political, and economic conditions of the Kurds that they have no control over. Hence, it lowers the profile and the agency of Kurdish political actors, or political actors in Kurdistan to be precise. It overlooks their choices and downplays the effects of those choices. So this leads to a certain misunderstanding I dwell on mostly in chapter 2 of the book, namely state centrism, because they don't distinguish between political community, don't distinguish political community from polity, and they assume that the Kurdish political elite tried to build a state of their own but failed to do so. I argue that the role of the Kurdish political, the role of the state is overemphasized in Kurdish politics. And I highlight that the Ottoman polity consisted of multiple political communities within one polity, and therefore I distinguish between the two. The political community and the polity, they are different things. Finally, I point out that the dominant Kurdish political elite throughout history actually mostly did not try to build a Kurdish state in the first place. Hence, the explanation that emphasized their failure do not seem to hold. At the second term, the Kurdish ethno-nationalism also problematic because it implies that civilization is one and has a linear course, and that these dictates certain political standards that politically mature societies uphold. So this linear approach suggests that Kurds failed to found a state of their own because they couldn't develop a national consciousness early enough in their history. So defining the Kurds as a traditional and backward ethnic group who lacked national consciousness and therefore failed to build a state of their own is problematic because it amounts to saying that they have only been victims and passive subjects in history. This denies them the agency of making choices. This view indicates that all important decisions regarding their fate have been determined by their physical conditions and the actions of others. So naturally, our nation building in the last 200 years has become a prerequisite for state building because nation building and state making have been associated with one another since the 19th century. The Kurdish political elite have not always sought the establishment of a Kurdish state. They didn't claim, I mean, So they didn't always claim or pursued nationhood or statehood. So the majority of, although this is the case, the majority of authors claim that the Kurds have failed building a nation state. They don't ask in which particular context of history they tried and failed. So within this framework of looking at political developments in Kurdistan, Kurds appear as anomaly or as the problem people who didn't manage to obtain their nation state and have become problem for all other nation states in the region. So this is the main approach or perspective I try to look at the developments in Kurdistan. And it will be fine to it's necessary to look at the context from where I started to do the research and how I arrived at these conclusions. So as most of the people who grew up in Turkey, you find yourself within a context where there is a conflict, of course, between Kurdish political movement and Turkey. And as everybody else, you start thinking of a solution to the problem. And I also started my research with the hope to find the best model of multiculturalism that could be applied to the Kurdish case in Turkey. But during the research, I realized that multiculturalism or minority nation building really doesn't capture Kurdish politics in Turkey. So I started shifting my focus from finding a model within the Western political philosophy and applying it to the Kurdish case. I started focusing on Kurdish politics itself. I did this in order to address state-centrism and the hegemony of Hobbesian sovereignty in the current scholarship. So two problems are created by state-centrism and the hegemony of sovereignty. The first one is the lack of a genuine political participation, and the second one is a suspicion, even hostility towards political diversity among the ruling elites. So on the one hand, representative institutions fail to provide citizens with democratic means necessary to shape the outcome as a result of their inadequacy to properly and fairly channel citizens' will into decision-making processes. This is one of the main issues raised by Occupy movements all around the world as well. So on the other hand, political theorists have pointed out at the issue of democratic deficiency within nation states and the international or supranational organizations created by them. So these political theorists have addressed issues such as citizen alienation, disenfranchisement, exclusion, and inclusion in political communities. They draw attention to the prevailing sense among citizens that they are not able to make any change or improvement to their socio-political conditions through their representatives or through representative institutions and processes of political participation. So I tried to shift the focus from the state or representative institutions or national institutions to the Kurdish politics itself. The purpose of doing this, I tried to emphasize the choice and agency of the Kurdish political elite or the Kurdish political movements. So mainly I draw attention to critical moments in Kurdish history where the choices made by the Kurdish political elite and the impact of their agency shaped the course of politics in Kurdistan. This is important because there are historical and contemporary aspects of Kurdish politics that are not or cannot be associated with state making. Along with a strong tradition of self-rule throughout their history and a persistent pursuit of autonomy in contemporary Kurdistan, there has been a tendency in Kurdish politics to steer away from state building. So my interpretation is that this is a choice rather than a failure on the part of the Kurdish political elite. And it is not a lack of what it takes to build a nation state, so-called a shared memory or national consciousness or national imagination. So these elements are mainly pointed out by Ernest Renan, who argued that nation is about a shared memory, or Max Weber, who argued that national consciousness is what makes the societies build their own state, or Benedict Anderson. These are famous nationalist theories. Anderson said there is a national imagination. So although no physical contact between all the members of the nation, they imagine themselves as a part of nation. So all these come together, and there appears, of course, the literature that communities or societies have to have these characteristics in order to be to build their nation state or to win independence. So seeing, analyzing this aspect of Kurdish politics has the potential to enrich the debate on self-rule in Kurdistan. I mentioned this. So there are two major, I think, historical moments where I build most of the arguments on. One is the 16th century incorporation of Kurdistan, most of the Kurdistan, Turkish or Syrian Kurdistan back then, into the Ottoman Empire in 16th century. So when I say the statelessness of the Kurds is somehow is also related to their choices and their agency, it might appear like I'm claiming that, or I arguing that Kurds choose to be stateless. No, that's not the case. What I mean is the political liberty in Kurdistan, or the understanding of political liberty in Kurdistan, is not really grounded on having a state or having a nation state. In 16th century, when Idris Bidlisi, one of the Kurdish notables, assembled a huge army that he brings together about 25 to 30 tribes, tribal confederations, and with his initiation or through his actions, Kurdistan, most of Kurdistan is incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. And after several wars fought and won by the Ottoman Sultan Yavuz Sultan Selim of the time, asked him, so let me know or tell me who is the most worthy among the Kurdish notables, beys or mirs, back then they were called, that I task him with ruling Kurdistan. And Idris Bidlisi's answer is very interesting and is telling. In the 16th century, he says, my Sultan, you know, the Kurdish notables are more or less all equals. None of them will be willing to bow their head before one of their equals. So it's better for us to remain as the way we are, and we don't want to follow one person or one leader or one Kurdish notable only. We want to be as free as possible in the current condition. And there's the same thing, or a similar historical moment appears in 1920 as well, when one of the Kurdish leaders in Turkish Kurdistan back then, he sees the Treaty of Sevres after the First World War that was signed between the victors of the First World War in Switzerland, and Article 64 of that Treaty of Sevres promises the Kurds a Kurdish state after 1 year if they manage to come together and prove that they are worthy of having a Kurdistan. And one of the Kurdish leaders, Cemil Çeto, my Kurdish friends will recognize the name. He gathers many leaders, Kurdish leaders, notables, begs or tribal leaders, and he asks them, well, this is the case, so we can have a Kurdistan, we can establish a Kurdish state, but we will have to choose a leader among us. And this is a folktale, by the way, not historically accurate, the information, but the story is a folktale. The leaders, the Kurdish notables present there, they say, well, we are not going to relinquish our autonomy and submit our will, our political will, or our freedom, or our privileges to one of the leaders among us. So the project collapses there, and the historical records shows, of course, Cemil Çeto tries to do it himself, but he's defeated by the Kemalist forces, the Turkish nationalist movement in 1920. So I focus on these two major events and some others in the 19th and 18th century, and moving or departing from there, I argue that there is a certain understanding of political freedom among the Kurds or Kurdish political leadership that doesn't see freedom or independence in establishing a state, but they see freedom as remaining away from state structures as much as possible. So this is also a thesis put forward by political theorist James C. Scott, who works on Asian societies. I refer to his work in the second chapter of the book, and I say there is some similarities between his thesis about Central Asia, certain people communities in South or Central Asia, and approach or the behavior of the Kurdish political leadership. So they want to keep the state at arm's length, and they actually prevent the establishment of a state from within Kurdistan or within among them. So this is a clear understanding of political freedom that sees freedom not within, not taking part or being within a state structure, but staying away from it as much as possible. So in Kurdish vernacular or in Kurdish literature or folk tales, state always appears as something strange or an outsider, an intruder, and most of the time as an oppressor. And this understanding of political freedom also prevents the birth of state from within the Kurdish society as well. This has been the case until the 20th century, of course. After that, there were Kurdish political or national movements who followed nationalist ideologies. So Kurdistan was incorporated into the Ottoman domain during the 16th century, and this was the choice or the way the Kurdish notables, the way they see politics is, or the political, the way they see political freedom is staying away from the state as much as possible. We come to 20th century, and of course things change for every society as well as for the Kurdish society. So remaining away, staying away from the state structures is not as easy as it used to be in 16th, 15th, or 17th centuries. New developments, new understandings of political freedom appear. So in the introduction of the book, I state that I set out to answer one question. So, do the dominant Kurdish political movements in Turkey and Syria operate within the confines of nationalism, or do they introduce a political community other than the nation state and its variations? So, the Kurdish movement is a national liberation movement in Turkey and in other parts of Kurdistan. And it will be sensible, of course, to assume that, as scholarship in general does, that Kurdish movements either demand territorial autonomy for the Kurds in Kurdistan, or they seek to establish a Kurdish nation state. However, my main argument was that the movement's discourse and praxis go beyond multiculturalist or group differentiated rights for Kurds in Kurdistan, and they also steer away from state-oriented nationalism. They do not pursue the goal of building a nation state for the Kurds. In other words, I imply that they indeed introduce a model of political community that's not confined within nationalist politics. So in this chapter, I will try to focus on that. But when I focus on the Kurdish liberation, national liberation movements, and the fact that they are not oriented towards state-centric nationalism or state-centric politics, I wanted to support this argument from those historical moments or from the historical data that is available to us. And in history as well, the Kurds appear to stay away or steer away from state as much as possible. So the fourth chapter of the book focuses exclusively on the project of democratic confederalism, because the project sets out to establish a model of political community that challenges and undermines the existing hegemonic models in the Middle East. I think my main contribution to the to the discussion will be on this chapter. As it focuses specifically on the project of democratic confederalism and how it differs from nationalism or from multiculturalism. So, two hegemonic political communities are in the Middle East, the nation state and the Islamic Ummah or Ummat, or autocratic and nationalist, sorry, not autocratic, theocratic and nationalist communities. So the crucial aspect of the Kurdish model of democratic confederalism is that it is tailored not solely for liberating Kurdistan from foreign or colonial domination. So although this is the core objective, it's not the only objective. The ultimate goal of democratic confederalism is ending the ongoing wars in the Middle East and establishing a political structure that will lead to peaceful cohabitation of a myriad of communities and their autonomous yet interdependent political entities in the region. Therefore, the project is designed to establish self-rule in Kurdistan via installing a model of political community that will radically transform the political order beyond Kurdistan, within and beyond Kurdistan. So how does the project do that? First, the movement that has come up with this project, the Kurdish movement in Turkey basically, has transformed the nationalist elements in its discourse. So the claim to national sovereignty in Kurdistan in the name of the Kurdish nation is now transformed into the claim to a form of self-rule in the name of peoples and communities of Kurdistan. So attention to the S, peoples and communities of Kurdistan. So this suggests a form of communal or communitarian control over the lands and resources of Kurdistan through a form of direct democracy as collective decision-making. This is the first way how they differ or do it. And the second one is the movement abandoned the goal of founding a Kurdish nation state. So actually, to begin with, this wasn't priority in the Kurdish political movement in Turkey in their agenda from the onset, because when they started in 1970s, their revolutionary struggle, ending Turkish colonialism in Kurdistan did not mean the same thing as founding a Kurdish nation state. Third, their politics go beyond obtaining cultural and territorial autonomy granted by nation states, which is common to minority nationalisms. On the structural and organizational level, the movement attempts to build self-governing towns and cities in Kurdistan and to connect them through a transnational confederation. So this could be the fact that the Kurdish political movement from the onset did not focus on founding a Kurdish nation state. It could be a matter of discussion, but we see this clearly in their in the literature published or in the generic material published by the movement. Revolution will start from Kurdistan. Kurdistan will be liberated, but the ultimate goal is not establishing a Kurdish nation state, but was spreading the revolution throughout Turkey and throughout the Middle East. So the movement's politics, as reflected in the project of democratic confederalism, are critical of four things. It's critical of the nation state as the hegemonic form of political community. It's critical of representative institutions of political decision-making. It's critical of absolute and indivisible sovereignty of a political authority that claims to represent a people or a nation. And finally, it's critical of citizenship based on cultural or national identity. Therefore, to articulate the components of the movement's politics in relation to discussions on political community, to support my argument that the project founds a model of political community that differs from the dominant ones in the Middle East, I will now start to referring to a specific work which was written in 1904. I think my friends from Turkey, most of them will remember the name Yusuf Akçura. So, who wrote an article in 1904, and he identifies three major political communities, or three major political visions of political community to be precise, that were dominant at the beginning of 20th century. But he mentions the Ottomanism, the pan-Islamist political vision, and the nationalist vision, and he suggests that the Ottoman political elite should opt for nationalist politics. But he doesn't mention the fourth vision of political community, which is the Kurdish vision of political community, or could be the vision of those communities who wanted to stay away or steer away from the state. So the project of democratic confederalism is actually a revival of the fourth model of political community that was not mentioned in the work of Yusuf Akçura. How many minutes do we have? Oh, sorry.
Very much up to you. We could, you know.
Okay, so I just maybe 10 or 15 minutes more. So some analysts have argued that we witness in the Middle East since 2011, what we witness is the equivalent of the 30 years war in the 17th century Europe. Others contended that the developments amount to the collapse of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, after which the post-World War borders in the Middle East were drawn by France and Britain. Both views have valid points. The Sunni and Shia division is one of the deepest and most perpetuated rifts that breeds conflict in the region. And but religious tensions have always had. So this can't be the case, to my understanding. I think the problem is much more systemic. So the crisis is systemic in its scope, and it's not only because of the claim that the Third World War is being fought via proxies in the region. It is systemic because the erosion of shared values and the death of a common Middle Eastern spirit, a la Nietzsche, have unleashed a phase of nihilism and civil wars that pit everyone against everyone in the region. That's because none of the century-old visions of political community, the Ottomanism, pan-Islamism, nationalism, and stateless self-rule, which is the fourth vision, have been able to generate shared values for the region after the demise of the old one. So the crisis is thus that of claims to sovereignty and of clashing visions of political community. The nation state, political Islam, or the Islamic Ummah, Neo-Ottomanism, and the Kurdish vision of self-rule, democratic confederalism, are the main contenders. So the rise of nationalism in the ensuing discord, sorry, I did jump. I looked at the works of Nietzsche, who wrote extensively on the crisis of shared values on Europe, and I think there is a crisis of shared values in the Middle East as well. I will just cut this short. So ideally, the elites that adopted these competing political projects would settle the internal discord and deal with the crisis of vision and identity through a confrontation. This would result in the foundation of one or multiple political communities, depending on who the winner will be. This was more or less what happened in Europe in the course of the 20th century. However, political actors in the Middle East have not been able to settle their disputes without interference from global and regional actors since the beginning of the 19th century. This doesn't mean that they neither had or nor have agency or that they have only been victims in the process. On the contrary, their agency and choices are among the main and most important ingredients. However, their agency and choices have not been the prevailing element in the equation. The intervention of European colonial powers and the First World War disrupted the process of reshaping old political communities, founding new ones, and forming collective identities for the region. So that the old is dying has to, the old was dying and the new couldn't be born, as I don't remember the name of Italian political theorist. So he said that the old was dying and that's the crisis. So the partition of the Ottoman Empire between a number of nation states has eroded the already weak solidarity between Muslims of different ethnic or cultural backgrounds. That's why the self-declared Caliph of the Islamic State proclaimed the end of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in his inauguration in 2014. So the agreement has been the symbol of the partition of the Ottoman Empire by colonial European powers, and therefore the moment that marks the destruction of the Islamic Ummah. So the Islamic Ummah, right? Sorry. And the caliphate by Christian powers. So some will put it, although the agreement was never implemented, that's how most Islamic scholars will put it, or some of them, sorry. So neo-pan-Islamic movements or actors, Islamic states, the Turkish ruling elite of this current government, they have been in power since 2002, are known or perceived as extremist, sectarian, or self-serving. So they cannot create shared values or a shared identity for the Middle East. So therefore, Islam is no longer the ground for a common identity or shared vision in the Middle East. The very factors that deposed the Islamic Ummah and destroyed the traditional ground of solidarity between Muslim majority societies, nationalism and the establishment of numerous nation states can hardly offer a way out of the crisis in the region. In other words, Islam, at least in the present context, has lost its hegemony as the provider of trans-ethnic, transnational political values, principles, and common goals, and as the overarching political identity for trans-border cooperation. The other forms also do not offer this. Nationalism doesn't offer, multiculturalism doesn't offer it for certain reasons that I cannot really go in detail now because of the time. So not having shared values or a common identity or an umbrella which people can come under together to form solidarity and solve certain problems. So this context is where the project of democratic confederalism assumes relevance. So a careful examination of primary and secondary sources on the ideology and practice of the Kurdish political movement in Turkey and Syria reveals that liberating Kurdistan has been only part of a larger goal for them. A more ambitious program has been pursued by the movements. They claim that the model of democratic confederalism is the answer to most critical questions in the Middle East. They say that they have never regarded the Kurdish question as a mere problem of ethnicity or nationhood. Rather, they believed it was the project of liberating the whole society and democratizing it. The movement's human composition and its ideology as well testify to this claim. The architect of the model says the foundation of a separate Kurdish nation state doesn't make sense for the Kurds because over the last decades, the Kurds have not only struggled against repression by the dominant powers and for the recognition of their existence, but also for the liberation of their society from the grip of feudalism. Hence, it doesn't make sense to replace the old chains by new ones or even enhance the repression. This is what the foundation of a nation state would mean in the context of the capitalist modernity. Without opposition against the capitalist modernity, there will be no place for the liberation of the peoples. This is why the founding of a Kurdish nation state is not an option. The call for a separate nation state results from the interests of the ruling class or the interests of the bourgeoisie, but doesn't reflect the interests of the people since another state would only be the creation of additional injustice and would curtail the right to freedom even more. This is from Öcalan's Democratic Confederalism. So what does then Democratic Confederalism stand for? So the architect of the model, Öcalan, suggests that in the Middle East, quote, a system which takes into consideration the religious, ethnic, and class differences in society should be promoted. He makes it explicit on the same page that his system does not make use of the right to self-determination for establishing a Kurdish nation state in Kurdistan, but builds a new model of homegrown democracy that will surpass boundaries. The project suggests that Kurdish activists, politicians, and organizations build grassroots democratic institutions in each part of Kurdistan. These institutions are communes, councils, popular assemblies, regional assemblies, youth, women, economic, and ecological councils. So Öcalan is convinced that political actors in Kurdistan and in the greater Middle East should not wait for the nation states to accept the demands for democratization and social justice put forward by citizens. They should take the necessary steps for liberating Kurdistan and creating a peaceful Middle East on their own, relying on their own agency and power. So this is what Chantal Mouffe has actually suggested. So the project is proposed by the Kurdish political movement originating in Turkish Kurdistan, and it has partially been implemented there in some towns and cities, but it was destroyed in 2015 by the Turkish state. So several academics or theorists have dwelled on it, and they referred to the model as a new model or an exemplary model for the Middle East. So I will skip that as well. Just to mention or to dwell on how does the Kurdish project differ from nationalist models of political community. So as a political community, it offers something that is not offered by nationalism or by theocracy. So a typical nationalist movement make use of the claim that it represents a nation and that they have the right to self-determination, to found a nation state of their own. For instance, Scotland, Catalonia, and the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq held referendums, and their claims were based in this understanding. So national movements legitimize the exercise of political power on the ground that the object of power, the nation, should also be the subject of power. Nationalist elites claim that they represent the nation and that the exercise of political power in the name of the nation is legitimate. Representative political institutions, by the same token, are considered to channel the will of the nation through electoral processes, civil society activism, and public discussion and deliberations. Therefore, a self-referential mechanism of exercising political power is established. So the claim is that ideally the nation makes the law that it is abided via electing their representatives. In other words, the claim is that political power is exercised in the name of the sovereign nation by the elected representatives. So the movement or the model actually challenges both practical manifestations and theoretical justifications for the nation state. In that sense, it claims to strive to expand political space beyond national boundaries via replacing representative processes, institutions, and mechanisms of political decision-making with local, provincial, and regional ones that are based on direct citizen participation. Therefore, the project is meant to undermine the principle of national sovereignty, question the legitimacy of demarcated borders, challenge representative democracy via establishing institutions of direct democracy, and finally, disapprove exclusive citizenship based on confrontation with the current hegemonic political order. Nationalism must refer to a nation and its right to self-determination in a historical homeland, no matter who the citizens are and how their political participation is arranged. The Kurdish project's point of departure is not a claim of the Kurdish nation to national sovereignty in historical homeland Kurdistan. The claim to self-rule in Kurdistan and in the Middle East is presented on the ground of freedom as an ethical principle. In other words, the claim to self-rule is not a reflection of the right to self-determination of the Kurdish nation embedded in international law. Self-rule or autonomy is claimed in the name of peoples of Kurdistan, regardless of whether they are Kurds or not, or regardless of whether they are a small community like the Assyrians or a large community like the Kurds. So the project also rejects the right to self-determination, which is the bread and butter of nationalist movements and the ground of national claims to sovereignty. So there are numerous empirical manifestations of that. I don't want to dwell on this much. That the political movement, specifically the political party in Turkey, is open to Armenian, Assyrian, LGBT, Roma, Muslim, Christian, atheist, and Yazidi deputies. That's a very important difference from other Turkish parties. And one of the most important aspects of the project is, of course, the feminist aspect. So it is one of the most important and unique characteristics of the administration in Rojava. So according to Öcalan, the architect of the project, women are the first colonized nation, and liberation and equality is not possible without their emancipation. Discussing the feminist aspect of the Kurdish movement is not the focus of the book, so I didn't write much on it. However, it should be noted that the politics of the Kurdish movement cannot be fully grasped without paying attention to its feminist agenda. So how much time? Sorry, it's so much. I thought I will be finishing it faster.
Well, maybe you'd like to go on to questions, and then if there's things that
oh
haven't
yes,
covered in the questions, you can pull them together in a final comment, in a final remarks. Does that make sense, Hanifi?
just say what I have in hand. So there are implications for our understanding of sovereignty, autonomy, and citizenship. And there are implications, especially for two phases of sovereignty. In the Kurdish project, sovereignty has two phases. So a lot of stuff, but it will be better, as you suggested, to discuss them in the questions.
I don't know if anybody other than me has questions. If you're, you should be able to, if you're on Zoom, put your, oh yeah, we've got two people with hands up. So Neil and then Leslie.
Maybe, yeah, maybe just, sorry, let me check if I find the place.
And then Connor, who's put a real hand up, not a virtual one.
Yeah, so should be 34. No. Yeah, it's here. So just one page where I note the implications. So the project is firmly placing itself within the current normative accounts of direct democracy. Several aspects of the hegemonic political community, the nation states, are altered or reconfigured. Referring to the question asked in the introduction, so I didn't actually mention that question, but there are, I referred to 4 elements of political community. So I would like to shortly enumerate these modifications. First, the Kurdish model of political communities suggests that members, citizens, cannot be represented by political elites through national institutions, but they should be participants directly contributing in political decision-making processes via local councils and assemblies. This is meant to replace obligation with solidarity. The bond that holds the community together is not vertical loyalty to a distant political authority, but a horizontal commitment to fellow citizens and residents. So there is an interesting take by the philosopher Louis Gordon, who says that when you act politically, it's never about you, it's about your fellow citizens. And I think the Kurdish project tries to replace the me in the equation with my fellow citizen. So therefore, the only criteria for membership in the people is residency within the political community. And the political community holds its own authority in governments. So the membership criteria, you don't have to be Kurd or Armenian in order to be counted as citizenship, as participant in politics. Only being resident is enough for that. I think it's very similar to the Scottish understanding of politics. So being resident in Scotland gives you the right to vote. This is a very similar understanding. Second, it's all residents, not only those who belong to a specific ethnic and national religious category. We have covered that. Third, the authority that is being claimed or indeed obtained by founding actors is limited to self-governance of the city, the town, the village, and the control of their natural resources. None of these autonomous entities cease to exist as a sovereign political entity, nor do they project their power and authority over other entities. Sovereignty is therefore fragmented and shared by spatial units, and sovereign powers stem from residence. In this sense, the Kurdish model is reminiscent of the drafting of the Constitution of the United States. We don't have to go on there deeper. The principle is that only power arrests power, and establishing multiple centers of power does not diminish it, but generates more. So additionally, the Kurdish model places emphasis on equal participation of gender, proportional participation of communities, environmental protection, and the promotion of cooperatives, collective production, and communes. Fourth, the agent of this project is the Kurdish political movement, represented in the person of mainly Kurdish political parties and armed forces. However, they have been trying to include and involve non-Kurdish communities in the administration of the Kurdish project. Rojava is a very well example. As Michael Tosic, who visited Rojava, has emphasized, so some degree of command seems to be essential, especially during the war, but always subject to and in compliance with the anti-patriarchal trust and with the rotation of positions of authority. I will end here. Basically, four elements or aspects of political community are being modified, transformed, and thank you for listening. I hope you haven't fallen asleep. I didn't really go through the whole thing. That was poor preparation on my part, but I thought I will manage to go through it all.
I think anybody who's ever tried to summarize a book, what they've written in a book, it's an impossible task, but thank you very much. You've covered a lot.
Well, thank you. Well, for the last 4 or 5 days, I tried to focus on one chapter only, but it didn't seem to be accurate. So I tried to put them together, and then it's too much volume-wise.
So hopefully, you know, some of the bits will pull together as well in the questions. So yeah, Neil, let me unmute you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
Oh, hello, yeah.
Hanifi, thank you very much. That's very interesting, and it's an honour to share some time with you this evening. I've got several questions, really, to be honest with you, because it's very interesting, but just to confine myself to one. Abdullah Öcalan, his role in all of this, a lot of your talk this evening has been about the historical side to all of this, going back, you said, to the 1600s, and some of the structures which are historical to the Kurdish people in the region. Abdullah Öcalan, he's been very much influenced, I understand, by the ideas of Murray Bookchin. So this brings us really right up to date, as it were. My question is basically this. To what extent do you think that the ideas of Bookchin and Abdullah Öcalan have influenced the Kurdish people? Or vice versa, to what extent have the traditions and the historical institutions of the Kurdish people or the institutions in this region, have they affected Abdullah Öcalan, and he's more of a spokesperson for them rather than a leader? I wonder if you have any views on that question.
Okay, thank you. So do I answer one by one, Sarah, or do we collect questions?
I think we found they're quite complicated questions. We've got about 3/4 of an hour. So.
Oh yes, yeah, the very difficult question. Yes, of course, there were actually places or pages I focused on Bookchin as well, but I couldn't go through them. The role of Abdullah Öcalan and the influence of Bookchin on Öcalan is very well actually studied aspect of the Kurdish project. So after Öcalan's imprisonment in 1999, he in prison, he of course he did a lot of reading, and he contacted Bookchin, and Bookchin's communalism and especially libertarian municipalism has shaped his thinking. So the fact that the Kurdish project is a stateless democracy or is a radical democracy, partially anarchism, what David Graeber, rest his soul, said, anarchism is about democracy without a state. So Bookchin has a lot of influence, of course, on Öcalan, on his project of democratic confederalism he proclaimed in 2005. But everything is not, of course, to my understanding, about modern influences of anarchism or anarchist political theorists. Öcalan very well was also aware of historical roots or historical tendencies within the Kurdish or Middle Eastern societies of a stateless understanding of political freedom or a stateless understanding of rule or independence. So to what extent I cannot really determine that, but I know from the literature and from my days in prison where I spent some time with Kurdish guerrillas or activists, political activists in there, they refer to the historical era. Do you remember which historical era was that the the hunter-gatherer societies started to farming, to transform to, or started farming and
Neolithic.
The Neolithic, yes. So they make a lot of references to the Neolithic, to Amargid, the Sumerian understanding of freedom. So I think Öcalan is very well versed in history in general and particularly in Kurdish history, and he is very well aware of the Kurdish notables' tendency to stay away from states or to steer away, to keep them at arm's length. But of course, 19th century where anarchist ideologies or ideas or theories appear, and this is hand in hand with Marxism. So he is also very well influenced by Marxism and anarchism. I think both play their parts, but to what extent I wouldn't know. They are now mostly, the Kurdish movement are now trying to find historical roots of their understanding of politics. So I think the emphasis now shifts from anarchism or from Bookchin's theory to historical sources of free societies, stateless societies, or democracies without states. That's what I can say now. I don't know if it is answered.
I think we'll.
It's very interesting. Thank you. That does answer it. I hope it comes out in your book. I look forward to reading it.
Oh yeah, thank you. Well, I am now focusing on historical roots as well, but there is some part of it, yes, in the book.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Can we move on to Leslie?
Hello. Thank you, first of all, for a most interesting talk. I'm afraid I'm absolutely no expert on the struggles of the Kurdish people, but very, very good. I was particularly impressed by your emphasis on the revolutionary structure of democratic confederalism. Also on the fact that the idea is it's based on residence, not ethnicity, or
yes.
As you rightly pointed out, as in Scotland, if you live in Scotland, I believe you have the right to vote if you're on the electoral register, I have to say.
Yes.
And also, I was most impressed by the emphasis on feminism as a condition for true liberation. Now, I'd like to ask your advice. I would describe myself as a revolutionary socialist anarchist. So I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that I don't have any illusions in the nature of the nation state, the state being an apparatus of capital suppression, basically, in our present circumstances. However, as I am in Scotland, I'm interested in whether you think that I should regard, shall we say, critical support for an independent Scotland as a total distraction from grassroots organisation, which I am involved in. Would it be appropriate to see the argument for an independent Scotland, which many people support because of the toxic UK government that's imposing austerities, has seen a disastrous mishandling of the pandemic, And last but not least, is now talking about total inhumanity to people trying quite legitimately to reach safety on British soil, refugees. I think a lot of people in Scotland, including myself, just want to distance themselves as much as possible from that kind of inhumanity. And if that means basically arguing for a referendum, arguing for independent Scotland, while at the same time having no illusions that that would solve all our problems, do you think that's okay, or should I just basically start saying to folk, look, Scottish, arguing for another referendum to distraction, an independent Scotland would be just going doing a cul-de-sac. Let's just go back to the basics and grassroots organising, try and overthrow the state from below, or is it legitimate to sort of regard as kind of sceptical pro-Scottish Republican position? It's a sort of transitional stage. Anyway, shut up. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I hope I understood you correctly. So the sound was going and coming back. So, well, of course, nationalism, as we know it, or probably nation states itself, Hannah Arendt also writes about it extensively, used to be liberatory, emancipatory, of course, when it was born in 18th century, although it was a bourgeois understanding of freedom, but it was emancipatory nevertheless when we consider empires, when we consider kingdoms where sovereignty was absolute, indivisible, and concentrated in the hands of one sovereign king. So nationalism in that sense took sovereignty from the hands of one person or a small group and supposedly give it to the whole people. So in that sense, in certain contexts, sovereignty or nation state or independence can actually be emancipatory. So I didn't have time to go through these two phases of sovereignty. Many political movements in Latin America use sovereignty, or political theorists like Claude Lafort, for instance, say that sovereignty could be emancipatory. Many political movements see it. So when we think of Scottish independence or Scottish nation state, a potential Scottish nation state, will it take us to a more liberal or a more free society, or will it be as oppressive as other nation states are? I think not. It will be important to note that not all nation states will be as oppressive as one another. But if we go to the basic concepts of sovereignty and that it belongs to one nation, it will always run into problems of minorities or migrants or communities that are not belonging to the majority of nation. It will run us into certain problems. And grassroots movements or arranging political participation at the grassroots level will help alleviate, if not eliminate, this problem. But I don't know, in certain respects, for Scotland, probably independence will be better. Because all important decisions are made in Westminster and people here are not happy with it. But of course, an independent nation state as Scotland could have its own problems. So what we have to do, we have to think about sovereignty. So the Kurdish, I couldn't mention this, the Kurdish project tries to replace the concept of sovereignty with autonomy. So if we think of autonomy and try to replace sovereignty with autonomy, it could probably help us arrange our political processes and institutions in a way that no community will be suppressed or oppressed. If we can do that, an independent Scotland will be fine, I guess.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Connor?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Hanifi, very much for a very interesting talk. So you emphasized residency as the basis for democratic confederalist model, which is certainly true. But you also discussed how previous approaches for organizing a political community had failed to develop shared values and vision for the people of the Middle East, and brief overview of Öcalan's vision for democratic confederalist society. However, in his articulation of the democratic nation concept, Öcalan also emphasizes the role of cultivating shared values and mentality amongst the members of the democratic confederalist political community. For example, freedom and autonomy, women's liberation, democratic politics and peaceful coexistence, and so on, as the sort of content of the collective social fabric, while preserving national, cultural, and religious difference, which you discussed briefly toward the end of your talk. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about your view on this aspect of the democratic confederalism project. Specifically, I'm wondering two things. How would you distinguish the democratic nation building project from classical nation building under the nation state model? And what, in your view, is the relationship between building the institutions of democratic confederalism and developing such a collective identity, mentality, and vision for the members of a democratic confederalist political community? Thank you.
Very good questions, and I'm really not sure if I can answer them. First, because I didn't study much the element of democratic nation. This is part that I haven't focused on it yet. I can't claim that I understand it very well. And the second building, can you repeat it? I couldn't take the note. The second question.
Unmute.
Yeah. Sorry. The relationship between the structures or building the institutions for democratic confederalism itself, like the model, and the mentality, the collective identity and values and vision, how those two interrelate and their sort of co-constitutive or not nature.
Well, the institutions of democratic confederalism, there are many. There are political institutions, there are councils like women's councils, cultural councils, religious councils, and there is social movements outside of there. So political institutions don't come in one sort. There are at least three sorts of political institutions. So this is to my understanding, is to build a mechanism of checks and balances to ensure that the idea of society, let society govern itself. We don't need the state. The ultimate goal is that society rules itself through these mechanisms. And this is the institutional part, and the mentality is, how can we say that? Well, the mentality is that belonging to a certain community or a certain national identity or a cultural identity really should not either privilege or disadvantage any group of people. So in order to assure that, or in order to ensure that, what are the borders, the boundaries? This is in democratic theory a classical problem. So how do you determine which community should rule themselves, or which community should self-govern through which borders? So where the border of this community starts and the border of the other community ends. In order to overcome this question, I think the residency component of the project comes in. So it is an Aristotelian understanding, I think, of natural communities. So like villages, neighborhoods. So these people have, there are face-to-face communities basically. And if we have the mentality,
the Bookchin element there for sure.
Yes, the Bookchin element is there. It comes from Aristotelian Athenian democracy. Mm-hmm. So and Jeremy Waldron's thesis of proximity is also there. So proximity means if you are next to each other, if you live together, then you will have to sort out your problems. So the mentality is that we do not govern on the basis of our identity. We govern on the basis of our proximity, our closeness, or our relationships to with one another. So institutions are there to give people a sense of shared values, a sense of identity, and residence, or the understanding of every community, every spatial or residential community has the right to self-rule, is to separate identity from government, or from self-rule, or from political power. I don't know if I put it, if it in any sense answers your question. So very difficult questions, actually. I don't know, maybe you can...
I don't know how to answer them either. So
yeah, you can write them to me and I can think on them, but the democratic nation basically says no national group should oppress the other, like should impose its culture, impose its language, impose its national identity. So we are the Turks, the national identity of the Turks should rule through laws. That's not democratic nation. Democratic nation says every nation should be able to preserve its culture without imposing it on others. So I think basically the democratic nation is that, but I will have to do some more reading on it because it's in my agenda. And the institutions and the mentality I try to express as much as I can. Difficult questions though.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Maybe we will try to answer it together later.
Sounds like a plan.
When you have your presentation.
Okay.
Can I just do a follow-up question before I let Paul in, who's just sent me a long question as well? And just, I mean, you've talked quite a lot about residency, but actually, of course, there is a lot of emphasis on cultural group, ethnic group, making sure that all the different groups are represented, which then does give power to those groups, and there can be a tendency then, you know, if you're seen as a member of the group, or it can set the groups in sort of an aspect, really. It's difficult for them to evolve. I mean, a lot of people don't fit neatly into groups, and it can actually give quite a lot of power to existing leaders of those groups, particularly as we can see on the ground in Syria when they're trying to do a very, very difficult tactical juggling. So I was just, so I can absolutely, see all the arguments that you've used, that there's not nationalism there, but I do think there's a lot of elements of multiculturalism there. And as someone who's been quite critical of multiculturalism, I'm also critical of that there. So, and quite a lot of similarities in a way to sort of Austrian cultural Marxism. So I wonder how you'd comment on that.
You are absolutely right. In any political setting, there is always a clash of rights, even within within the body of human rights treaties, within the body of international human rights treaties, within text, or within political settings. There are clashes of rights, or there is discord or tension between the main idea of a political community and how you implement it. So although the main focus is on residence, and political power supposedly flows from residence, there are cultural groups like Assyrians or like the Yazidis, and in Rojava we see that actually the administration gives them arms, or allows them to be armed in order to protect themselves. So this will be a tension, and there will always be a tension between whether it's cultural or religious groups, that whether the priority should be given to cultural or religious groups to preserve their identity to preserve their culture, or should we impose universal human rights and try to protect women or children from these certain harmful practices of these cultural or religious groups? This is a very important question in any setting. Like in the United States, you see the Amish, you know, they have a certain understanding, certain way of life, and the state doesn't really interfere. And in the Kurdish case, there are certain Kurdish or Arab families or tribes who have a certain way understanding of life. So if you try to impose the understanding of the administration, then they should send their children to schools, and certain groups are not open to this. Arab or Kurdish men will marry two women, and you have to impose the understanding that comes from universal human rights. And there is a clash, and I think as far as I can see, they try to navigate very carefully in order not to impose their way of life on those people, but at the same time try to protect individual rights of people within the administration, and this will be always a source of tension. So my understanding is that universal human rights, individual rights, should come first when it is about individual persons, but you have to be careful not to impose your way of life on communities. It's a matter of finding a balance. I am not a practitioner. I don't know how people do it, but they always will have to find a way to go around this tension. And it will be always in the making, I guess, because it's not a matter of the Kurdish model or the Kurdish political administration there. It's a matter of in the UK as well. So how do you go about this, I don't know, genital mutilation, female genital mutilation is a very big problem. It happens in the UK as well. We see it from time to time. So do you impose the understanding of human rights on religious communities in order to ban this practice, or do you let them have their way of life? I think the first one is more important. So human rights should trump certain harmful cultural practices. I think the administration is also trying to do that, but it's not as easy because you don't also want to scare them away.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of parallels with the discussions with the Jews in the Bolshevik movement, which is what I looked at, and the discussions of religion and how they looked at religion. But I'm not going to go on with that because that's my hobby horse, and I'm going to hand over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and really a wonderful presentation, Hanifi. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for listening.
Yes. So actually, the question that I asked online, I'm going to slightly modify it in light of Sarah's exchange with you, because I think that you've really brought in a lot of very important aspects. I think that, from a theoretical standpoint and from the viewpoint of democratic confederalism, and the triad, I think the choice, is very clear. I think there's a huge, buy-in, and I think there's a lot of common thought among the population, whether it be in Rojava, whether it be in Bakur. The people, regardless, they're Kurdish, they're Assyrian, they're Armenian, they're even some Sunni Arabs.
Yes.
We see in Rojava the buy-in from women, from men, from different ethnic groups, different genders. So I think also we see the goodwill of the autonomous administration, admitting that these are real problems, that we have to take diversity very seriously. And I think that the challenge is the challenge is the Turkish nation state, and when we compare Rojava to Bakur, we see that the main vector or the main factor driving an outcome is that, at least in the parts of the autonomous administration which are not under Turkish and jihadist occupation, they are able to move forward with the democratic and federalist project in an extremely innovative way, whereas in Bakur you have this huge impediment, where the mayors are getting arrested and all these other things that we have. So I wanted you to comment, Dr. Baris, on how you see that kind of cause and effect between having the Turkish nation state or not, and the outcome in terms of what is able to be accomplished on the ground, whether it's women's emancipation, whether it's social ecologist outcomes, whether it's direct democracy, and moving toward the future also, because I know that in your talk you talked a lot about a specific time period, but how do you see this moving forward?
Well, thank you very much. When I talked about implication, I mentioned the act of foundation. That's a concept in Hannah Arendt. So the act of foundation means the act of constituting a political community and making its constitution, or drafting its constitution. So this is very important in this case, because Turkish government of today is a big, the biggest threat actually to peace and well-being in the Middle East, because they have now assumed a new politics of Ottomanism. So try to basically re-establish the Ottoman dominance or the perceived Ottoman dominance that used to have in the Middle East. Well, actually, in the Ottoman times, the Kurds were freer. They enjoyed a much more autonomy than they ever did until the Turkish Republic. So this is a big challenge, and this is where the Kurdish, the act of foundation comes. So if the Kurds want to implement their understanding of politics or their project of democratic confederalism, it appears that they have to do it by force. And it is the same, this point is valid for any other model of political community. That's why I say in the Middle East, there are 4 clashing visions of political community: the Kurdish democratic confederalism, the neo-Ottomanism, the pan-Islamism represented by the Islamic State or other Islamic movements, and the nation state. So they are always in constant fight, and none of them have been able to provide common or shared values which people will voluntarily buy into and say, well, this is a good project, we want to live by this. And none of them also have been able to impose it by force. So the nation states have been, 4 nation states especially, have been trying to impose nationalist policies in Kurdistan, but all of them have failed. So the Kurds are not free, but they haven't been assimilated as well. So all in all, it's probably a very bleak picture or understanding, but it seems like if you want to promote a political model, then you should be able to defend it, because otherwise Turkey will not let you have it. So if the Kurdish armed forces are defeated, most probably their political project will also be defeated. Although it will be, of course, living in books and in people's, in individuals, in ideas. But the act of foundation, as it is in political theory, and most political theorists will probably concur to that, you have to have the force, the power to implement what you have in your mind. Otherwise, it will be always in your mind. So it depends on the power or on the strength of Kurdish political movements and their armed forces. So I used to think that, well, armed forces are not necessary. well, I was wrong because we all witnessed the Yazidi community. So basically, you have human rights, but there is no international or domestic mechanism to protect your human rights. Even your state tramples upon your human rights, and there is nobody that coming to your help. And the Yazidis underwent another genocide in 2014. It was only the Kurdish armed forces in Syria that managed to save them from a complete annihilation. So having this force seems to be very important in today's Middle East. If they will be in Europe, probably it wouldn't be necessary. So in that context, their power, their strength will mean the most, I guess. And they need the solidarity of the international community, if we can speak of, but they generally stay passive and they don't intervene. But unless there is an umbrella produced or extended to them by bigger forces or larger, I don't know, stronger forces like the European Union and United States, they have little chance, of course, of implementing this project in the Middle East. But they will survive. They have always survived, even if it is the only Kurdish mountains. Their friends, they will, I think, manage to carry on.
Thank you. Do you want to come back, Paul?
That's a great point that you're making. The might doesn't make right, but it guarantees survival, and it allows you to live another day, so you can continue to implement your vision. And I'm sure that Eleanor Roosevelt would be turning in her grave, that she had this view of, the United Nations and how we could all get along. And I think that Erdogan, the Saudi royal family, Trump, and the mullahs in Iran have shown us that it's just you need something more than that. So absolutely, I concur.
Thank you. We've got another question from Neil, and I don't know, is there any questions from Facebook? Has anybody checked checked if there's any questions from Facebook? Well, I'll do that while we just have the question from Neil, and then.
Yeah, okay. Hello again. Thank you very much. You're just mentioning a little while ago, you're saying that the main threat from Turkey is one of military force. Just to make a comment there and invite your views on the matter. We've got the political developments which have been happening within the last week. And I think that the Turks, not just using military force, I think they're managing to move along the lines of the divide and rule political line now. As I understand it, the Kurds which you've got in northern Iraq, somewhat represented by the group referred to as ENKs, are fairly close politically to the Turks. And we've heard within the last week or so that the administration in northeast Syria is now going to share power between ENKs and the PNKS, I think they're referred to as, yes, on a virtually equal 24 seats, I think, in the assembly that they've got there. So my comment here is that perhaps Turkey is now acting politically as well as militarily and dividing the region along political lines and along these tensions as opposed to other things. I wonder, make a more direct question to you. To what extent do you think that the influence of the Kurds in northern Iraq is going to water down the politics of the situation in northeast Syria?
Well, yeah, it's hard to, of course, make an accurate prediction, but Kurdistan regional government has mainly depended on its relations, particularly economic relations with Turkey. So, and they don't want to be, of course, suffocated by Turkey from one side and Iran from the other side. I don't know if you are hearing me because your camera is.
Well, yes, I can hear you. I can hear you very well.
So your camera was frozen. Sorry. So. The main thing for Turkey is getting rid of what it sees as an alternative political vision, which is the the Kurdish vision of democratic confederalism. So you can exist, Turkey's main proposal to the Kurds, of course, you can exist, but without any political status. So if you demand a certain political status, or if you come up with a political project that doesn't fit within my political view, I'm not going to allow you to implement it or to further it. So it tries to suffocate these alternative visions or alternative views in Kurdistan. But if you share the worldview with the government, like you are also emphasizing your Muslim identity, you are emphasizing the, I don't know, acknowledging the superiority of the Turkish nation state and the Turkish worldview in the region. If you at least do not challenge it, then you can survive. And the Kurdish regional government in Iraq is, I mean, it's between Iraq and a hard place, basically. They want to be in solidarity with the Kurds in Rojava, but they have different worldviews. They don't want to be suffocated, and they don't want to suffocate, I think, the Kurds in Rojava, but they are under great pressure from Turkey. So probably Turkey wants to get rid of all the PKK or YPJ elements in Syria and connect it more with Turkish and with Turkish and Kurdish regional government. I mean, try to stifle or suffocate the revolutionary dynamic, the democratic dynamic in Syria. If it sees that there is no challenge there, then probably it will not intervene militarily, and political intervention, trying to build a satellite administration in Syria, then they will be okay with it. So, but that they haven't got there yet. So the main talks between, I think, Kurdistan regional government and the northeastern administration in Syria is sending mostly those who are related to the PKK, sending them out of the country. I think some authors, one author about several weeks ago, they said that Turkey identified 3,000 individuals, and they asked their removal from Rojava. So Turkey tries to dominate or design things politically there, but if it doesn't see things are happening according to its will, it's going to intervene militarily, and I don't think Kurdistan regional government or Kurdistan region has much say in it, because they also don't have the means to counter Turkish claims or Turkish intervention. Although I think that they are friendly in many senses.
Oh, I think that just answers it. Hanifi, you seem to think then that the Kurdistans in northern Iraq, they are cooperating, if that's the right word, with the Turks because of the pressure from the Turks, rather than an ideological compatibility between the regime there and the Turkish regime?
I think there is, to a certain extent, you know, the understanding of because the Kurdish regional government or the Kurdistan, South Kurdistan, is also ideologically close to other to the Turkish state.
Yeah.
But I don't think I wouldn't go as far as saying that they would choose and pick the Turkish nation state over their brethren in Syria. The way I see it, they want to see all 4 parts of Kurdistan free, and this is their main idea, actually.
Yeah.
But what they can do is very limited, and sometimes they even have to bow before power that is much superior than them militarily. So they fought with the PKK in the past, but they fought with Imam Talabani's party as well. So this internal fighting has been there from time to time, but it is nothing that any of them actually prefer. So when they have to do it, when it's a matter of survival, you don't know who will do what. So there is this still danger of turning the Kurdistan regional government against Syria, but the talks are still ongoing within the 24 political parties in Rojava and with other parties, NKS, as you said. They are not finalized yet, and we are hoping that it will be finalized in an understanding between the two parts of Kurdistan. And the United States role, I think, there is important because they are trying to do it. So this is all, of course, to please Turkey. And Turkey, if they think that they have got what they wanted, probably they won't intervene militarily. That's all about it, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know. So they are waiting for these talks to finalize, and then eliminate the PKK elements within the Rojava administration, and make things work without any alternative vision. But we will see how things go probably in the next years. I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't know if it answers your question, but things
yes,
are just shaky, quite shaky right now.
It's going to lead towards some form of election, isn't it, at some time over the next
Yes.
year or so?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And in this election, probably all other parties will also be part if they make a final understanding. So finally, you will have to go set some administrative mechanism that will be elected. And in these elections, other parties should also be able to be in the elections. That's how it should be in any way. You cannot just get rid of other political parties. Other Kurdish political parties should also be in the region.
Okay.
So Hanifi, I'm going to give you a few last words in a minute, but just before you do that, just to let people know that our next Kurdish Tuesday, which is in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at relationships with the European Union. We'll have Nikolaj Wilkinson, MEP, and we'll have Faik Yegisi from the HDP representative in Strasbourg to talk to us in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
So, Hanifi, would you like to sum up or say a few last words?
Well, thank you very much for bearing with me so far. I know the presentation wasn't as good as I hoped it could. I hope it should be, or it would be. So, but the book will be out in about 20-25 days. So, all those who want to continue the discussion, they can reach to our Facebook or to our emails, and we can continue the discussion. So this is a discussion. Nothing is, of course, being decided by anyone. We try to see things. I try to see things from a different perspective, and I think this is important in order to focus our energy, our research on what goes on with the Kurdish movements itself, and not putting much emphasis on how the states, Eurocentric or nation or state-centric understandings will see them. So I hope this will be a contribution to that discussion anyway.
Thank you very much, and thanks for answering some quite difficult questions there.
Yes, very difficult.
Yeah, we will all look forward to carrying on the debate. And just a reminder to anybody who's in or around Edinburgh on Friday and can come along to outside the Scottish Parliament round about 2 to meet the marchers who will have walked through from Dundee, who are leaving Dundee 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, to draw attention to what the Turkish state has been doing to the movement that we're all here to support. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.